¿Qué pasa, HSI familia? And welcome back to ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? I'm your host, Dr. Regina Ann Garcia, and on this episode, we're jumping into the current state of Hispanic serving institutions under the 47th President of the United States, aka he who shall not be named. I don't know about y'all, but I missed us. I missed the show, and I missed our amazing guests. And I missed the opportunity to think deeply about servingness and all its complexities. But we're back, and me siento muy excited. I've never come up with a theme for the seasons of Que Pasa HSIs, but this season is intentionally crafted to allow us space to mourn and grieve the loss of $350 million in federal discretionary funding to HSIs as of September 2025, and to work towards hope, healing, and joy. I want us to sit with the grief and the loss that we're feeling as long as we need to before moving into healing and hope. We should mourn the loss of the funding that provided jobs for many of our Latine identified colleagues and many of our Latine identified students who were hired to carry out Title V projects. We should mourn the loss of programs and services that supported so many Latine identified students. And while I acknowledge that HSI grants are intended to serve all students and intended to support capacity building of the entire campus, I want to center Latine identified people in this season because it's my podcast and I can, and also because if we strive to serve all, we serve no one. It's the equity piece of the DEI equation that we cannot afford to lose because without equity minded practices, we will be mid, as the young people say, at best, and harmful at worst. Without a targeted focus on equity, we will recreate and exacerbate inequities, and I'm just not willing to promote those types of practices. So with that in mind, let's get into today's topic and today's guests. I am joined by Dr. Rebecca Perdomo, a senior research associate with the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions and the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Justice, and an independent consultant whose work spans policy analysis, strategic research, and public-facing insights for higher education, government agencies, and national advocacy organizations. In 2021, she served as HAKU's Director of Policy Analysis, where she translated research into policy recommendations, supported congressional advocacy, and created a national HSI dashboard for making enrollment data accessible to students, parents, and policymakers. I've been consuming her research and policy work with great intention, and I hope you will too after hearing about what she has been up to lately. Pues vamos, let's do it. Dr. Rebecca Perdomo, thank you for joining us on Que Pasa HSIs, where we talk about all things HSI. But first, let's hear about your journey into HSI work.
Hi, so thank you so much for having me. I'm so very excited to be here today and as a part of the very long list of wonderful people we've had on the podcast. So yeah, I'll just give a brief overview. I grew up in Miami, like a very typical Cuban family. Parents were born there, grandparents immigrated when they were children, or when my parents were children. And I was always growing up with this narrative about we came here, we did this, that kind of immigrant narrative, right? And then I went to college and that was a really great experience, but I majored in sociology at UCF, which was an emerging HSI at the time. I didn't know what HSIs were at the time. And it was actually during my time there in studying sociology that I was given the language to understand, yes, I grew up hearing about how we came here and I have this opportunity and I have to make the most of it. But I started really seeing and putting a name to the disparities that I also saw, that not everyone had that access to education. And so that's when I pursued my master's degree in sociology at University of Georgia. And I just became so enamored with understanding this and putting a name to it. But then I really wanted to move into applied work, which is when I moved from sociology of ed and higher ed into taking that sociology lens, higher ed policy, where I got my doctorate degree at UGA. And it was in that I ended up applying for an internship with HAKU, which I got in the government relations team in summer of 2017. And my work just really continued on from there. My dissertation was HSI focused. I worked for HAKU. And then now as a consultant, I do work for Center for Minorities Serving Institutions. And so, yeah, it's just snowballed from there.
I love to hear about how people got into HSI work. And I mean, I think most of us don't know we are at an HSI or even an emerging HSI, right? When we're there, we went to an emerging HSI. Wasn't on my mind. A very unique thing, as we know about HSIs, people don't pursue it like the way they might pursue, right, like an HBCU. We fall into it, right? And now we are doing important work, right? Including you, the work you're doing. So super excited for this conversation. So you recently published a policy brief called The Impact of Trump Administration Funding Cuts on Hispanic Serving Institutions that I want to talk about. I mentioned in the introduction that the loss of HSIs following the September 10th announcement that Title V Part A and B program funds would be reprogrammed was about 350 million, but you actually clock it at much higher level of 507.9 million. So tell us about what you found and the data analysis you conducted.
Yeah, so I'm very excited to talk about that. So yeah, as we all know, on September 10th, 25, the Department of Ed did end discretionary funding for MSI programs. And so I wanted to quantify what that means. And so what I did was, instead of looking at just a funding cut, like how is this really affecting institutions? So I looked at the Developing HSIs program, Title V Part A, Title V Part B, which is the Promoting Post-Baccalaureate Opportunities for Hispanic Americans. And then I also included Title III Part E, which is the Minority Science and Engineering Improvement Program. Now, I think some people were wondering why you included that, because it's MSI broadly, but I did because at the end of the day, HSIs that were receiving that MSEIP funding was only on the basis of there being an MSI, because that was a broad grant. So what I did was I went and I selected all of the HSIs from that list that had that grant, and then I did the same analysis for them. So the method essentially consisted of taking each year's awards from 2021 through 2024, and then I just did a kind of basic multiplication table. So 2021, that was multiplied, although let me make a caveat. Title V, Part A and B, those were 5-year awards, but MSEIP was only a 3-year award. So they would have only lost 1 year of funding with this, and so I adjusted accordingly. So yeah, then I did so on and so forth. Those from 2022, the Title Vs were multiplied by 2 years of funding loss and so forth. So what that came out to was a whopping $507.9 million in losses, which was jarring, to say the least. Over 250 HSIs across 20 different states, with naturally California, Texas, and Puerto Rico being hit the hardest because, of course, they have the most HSIs. But to put it concretely and to make sense of that story, it's basically, for example, if an institution had received $3 million in DHSI grant funds in 2023, they would be losing $1.8 million across the 3 remaining years out of that $3 million that they would have been promised.
Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing the analysis too. I feel like, okay, now people could recreate it if they wanted to, but you don't have to. Don't worry. Rebecca's doing it for us, and I appreciate that because I'm definitely not going to do the analysis. But when I saw it come into my email box, I was like, this is what I needed. Thank you very much.
That really feels good to hear. It was frustrating, right? It was fueled by anger, but hearing responses that like, this is what we needed to put that number to it felt good. So thank you.
Yeah, for sure. We definitely needed it. So let's talk about Title III Part F, which unlike Title V Part A and B, which are they're mandatory funds, right? The Title III Part F. And I think that's become very clear, right? We need to make sure that we understand these different titles have different, or different parts really have different sort of aspects here, right? So Title III Part F is mandatory funds, and therefore they were saved, right, from the September 10th reprogramming. But at the same time, some of those grants were also defunded due to their focus on DEI language. I actually talked to one PI who said he was given the opportunity to change the equity-focused language in his grant, and he chose not to, which I think is super commendable, but he also suffered the consequences, which he was actually defunded. His Title III Part F was defunded. Another, why didn't you include Title III Part F in your analysis? And what are your thoughts on this program and its potential for life under this administration as a mandatory versus the discretionary type of funding?
Yeah, so I'll say that is such an incredible story that you mentioned. Someone who was like, no, I'm not doing that. And like you said, he suffered the consequences, and it's hard, right? It makes you take a deep breath. But so regarding this program, so the reason I didn't include it, like you said, right, I was basically going off the notice. And so that's why I only included those discretionary, like we are definitely going to be cut programs. And I will actually say I did gather all the data for it because I wanted to see what it looked like. So offline, I can actually send you some of that if you'd want to see what it looked like. Part of it was also because it wasn't going to be consistent cuts for that program. So I had no way to like argue this is what's definitely being lost here. And so I wanted to And this goes into the main explanation, which is I think a lot of times people like to go for the highest, the biggest, the most shocking number, but the numbers stand on their own as they are. They are shocking as they are. And I don't want anyone to be able to accuse me of inflating the case and then being able to knock down the argument because, like I said, it stands on its own. It's important as its own. And that stem and articulation is important. And regarding your question about the future of it, I hesitate to fully answer that because it's dicey. And I think the biggest word we can say around it is it's uncertain. I think people are going to keep trying to do what they can. But as you said, some people have already lost this funding. And I'm currently doing a project which I can talk about later. But we are talking to grant administrators at HSIs to learn more about what's happening on the ground. And so I'm in the process of actually learning about that right now.
Yes, awesome. I know, and I figured that would be the reason you would say, but also just wanted to make sure we
Yeah,
talked
certainly.
about that. This idea of two programs were discretionary and one was mandatory, right? And what does that even mean, right, from a policy perspective? I think a lot of us are learning a lot more about this policy because of the defunding now because we have no
Mm-hmm.
choice, right? Like we had to a bit more like
Yeah.
cushiony, right? You don't have to think much about it. And now digging into the complexities of these fundings, right? These
Yeah.
racialized fundings. So let's talk about another policy brief that you published called Caring or Capitalizing, how HSIs leverage Title V funds. In this brief, you and your co-author reviewed 70 HSI Title V 2022 grantee abstracts, and in many ways found similar results as previous studies that conducted a similar analysis. In 2018, my now colleague Nicholas Vargas reviewed 220 Title V grant abstracts for grants funded between 2009 and 2016 and found that 85% did not center Latine students and were instead framed as serving all students. Several other scholars have replicated the same study reviewing Title V grant abstracts and found similar results, that HSIs rarely focus on Latine students in their programming efforts. So talk to us first just about your analysis and what you found about what you titled opportunistic grant seeking versus what you called targeted efforts. I really liked those
Thank you.
distinctions.
Yeah. So I was building on this really important body of work by your colleague, as well as Stephanie Aguilar Smith and other people who'd been building in this area, because I think we all have these burning questions. What are we doing with this money? Is it going in the right direction? So what and I will shout out my colleague here, Loa at University of Georgia, he was wonderful to work with. We got together and we wanted to look at more recent data. So we were able to look at 2022 grant applications. And I thought it was also really important to look at this post-COVID, right? And one of the things that we were really curious about was post this attention to race and racism and this broader conversation that had grown, had anything changed? And we didn't do a full comparative analysis, but we already had that literature to go off of. And so in that, what we did was we ended up creating 4 categories and we looked at 7 applications in 2022. We did exclude Puerto Rico only because of kind of a different geographical context, although they are very important. Shout out to Puerto Rico. So we created 4 categories based on how institutions use their funds. So there was missing, so no mention of Hispanic or Latinx, Latine at all, which was really wild to see that even existed. When we were going through that, I was like, do we have to create a category for this? And astoundingly, yes. So then there was combined, which was institutions that listed at least one activity that was targeted and one that was generic. So generic meaning didn't address anything, targeted meaning they have something focusing on Latinx or Latine students. Targeted was its own category, and so that means all funds were directed towards specific student groups focused on Latine students. So when I say specific students groups, this could mean a number of different things. And so that was going to be those that look specific. Those could include like low income, under-resourced, whatever other kind of like coded language people use. So what we found was that 40% were what we termed opportunistic, which was essentially they use the language, right? They reference the Latinx, Latine population, and they sometimes even explicitly acknowledge that there are disparities in the language, in the grant. But then when you looked at the actual program activities, none of them were actually targeted towards the students that they framed their narrative around. And so that's where that opportunistic, it was like, oh, so you're using our name, you're using like nuestra gente, and you're trying to get this money, but you're
Mm-hmm.
not gonna actually target your activities towards them. Like super interesting, right? So I think that's maybe you can say I felt some type of way about it, as I think other scholars doing this work have. But yeah, so we found only 3 out of the 70 were actually fully targeted. Again, 40% were opportunistic, so it's pretty jarring. But yeah, the pattern holds in the previous research. Many HSIs were ultimately capitalizing on racialized funding without actually directing their resources towards the students whose enrollment is what makes that eligible for the funding in the first place.
Yep. Over and over again. We keep seeing it, right? Yeah, the opportunistic sort of approach. And I think that's like when I read the report, I get upset, right? Like I read it a couple times and I'm like, I am upset at the loss of Title V funding for HSIs, at least for now. We're not sure what the future holds, but for now. But then when I read it, your brief and others, right, I feel angry. And then there's a part of me, and I'm going to say something really controversial that I'm like, HSIs deserve to be defunded, right? Yeah, I said it, but let me explain, right? That I don't think that HSIs are discriminatory, which is what this administration thinks, right? This administration says the 25% makes them discriminatory and it's against the Harvard versus Students for Fair Admissions ruling, right? So I get that. That's what they're saying. And I don't agree with that, right? That's not the case. And HSIs are not discriminatory. But what I want to put us on a timeout for is we haven't been intentional, right? HSIs haven't been intentional using the funds for what they're intended for. And in some ways, it's we need to spend this time rethinking, like, how have we been using those funds? When the funds come back, I'm going to just put it in the universe that they come back. Then what's the new approach? Funds were allocated for HSI so that they could level the playing field for Latinas enrolling in under-resourced institutions, and in many ways level the playing field for the actual institutions themselves. But that's not exactly what happened. So I definitely am hoping over time, and with so many scholars like yourself, like I said, this study's been replicated multiple times, calling institutions in and providing evidence that many were submitting Latina invasive grant proposals, that they would change their grant behaviors, right? I'm hoping, right, in the future that maybe that's what happens, right? But we just haven't seen that. So there is a part of me that wants these HSIs to figure out servingness without the funds. HSIs, y'all are on punishment. And the question becomes, how are you Hispanic enrolling institutions going to serve the largest population on your campus, right? Which is the case with many HSIs. This is your largest population. And now you have to think about doing it without the funds. And the funds are so important. And I want those funds to come back. And for now, we got to figure it out without the funds. So that's some of my thoughts. I know controversial and you don't have to agree with me, but just wanted to say that and see if you had any thoughts, right? On like, how do you feel about over and over again, the same study showing the same thing, the Latina approach?
Yeah, so hot take, Gina. But I think it's a great one, a really interesting one. Leave it to you to say the hard thing. I want to take a minute because I think this is really layered. And even though you just heard me express some frustration as you have as well, I give space to realize that I think one thing that can be kind of easy to miss or overlook when you're in our, and I by our, the researcher's position, is that I would venture to say that probably the majority of people doing HSI work on the ground care, right? Like they are largely invested. They want to help Latina and other under-resourced students. I think a lot of them do. But I think one thing, reflecting now on this work, now that time has passed, that could strengthen this type of work is giving some additional attention to context, right? So as we're all finding these similar findings in different ways, what does that mean? What is actually going on in these offices? Where are these institutions, right? So sure, some of them may be fully opportunistic and someone might really be sitting there being like, hey, like here's a pot of money we're eligible for, go get your bag, right? They may be super savvy individuals, years of grant experience, gave me the money, don't care where it's coming from, don't care why. On the flip side, I also think there are people who are in tiny HSIs who are a one man or woman show, and they might be working in kind of a tough context that doesn't want anyone talking about HSIs. And you have to think about what that might look like, right? I think people working for and getting these grants are often working within that environment of constraint. But I think that they were already doing that at the time that this research was being done. And now that's even more so today, right? So there are people who say, hey, I have to work in with this system. And so they might use the term under-resourced on paper because perhaps it's more palatable for the administration that is working for them, who's giving them their job and giving them their paycheck. And so they're like, I'm going to navigate what I can in this context to move us forward. And I was thinking a lot about this idea, and I was talking with a colleague of mine, Ashley Meadow, who she actually was affected by the Doge cuts, and she's done a lot of work. She's an expert in international development. And one thing that she talked about, because that I've listened from her perspective, is her work focuses on answering why programs don't achieve what they set out to do. And I think this consists of uncovering misalignments between what programs say they do and what they'll actually do. And I think that's something that kind of happens with this Title V funding. And that's what I think this conversation is missing. So I think we need to leave room to understand that some people really are doing all they can in these opposing environments. And I think honestly, if we did some type of landscape analysis or other types of evaluation, we might learn more about these stories, because the gap between what programs say that they're going to do and what they actually do, I don't think it's always in bad faith, much as we might get frustrated. I think sometimes it's about a misalignment from operating in complicated environments.
Yes, I love that. I love that response. And like I said, my comment was going to be controversial because there's that, but everything you said is, I get that too, right? And I spend a lot of time with
Yeah.
these HSIs, so I see that, right? I'm like, this podcast is dedicated to the good work of a lot of people that have come on this podcast are grant
Mhm.
directors, right? The HSI grant directors and or coordinators, people who are have used these Title V funds in very good ways, right? So there's that, right? Like we know that is good work going on the ground, and there's such a disconnect often between what was actually written and what actually
Right.
happens to go, what happens goes on, right? Because you write it to get it, right? Versus actually then goes on, which can diverge a little bit, right? It has to align. You have to still fulfill the objectives of the grants, but people were using these funds in productive ways, and we've seen some pretty dramatic and important services and programs that are now no longer funded because of that, right? That we're really doing some good work with campuses that
Yeah.
really needed these funds. Yeah, we got to complicate it, right? That's why I was like, okay, I'm going to say it, right? To just talk through, come on, y'all, we've got to figure this out. We've got to figure out what it looks like to move into, I keep telling people, moving into the mission-based MSI
Mhm.
world, where it's actually at your core mission that it's always going to be. It's going to be in any grant you write, it's going to be in any program you propose, anything you do is going to have your Latine identity at the center, right? Your
Mm.
students at the center of it, because
Mhm.
your mission, right? If we can get point where these are mission driven institutions, which I think that's
Mm.
where we're headed, right? That people are getting to that point where this is what our core mission is. It's going to take some time, but we'll get there. We'll get there. So, in a third publication, and all of these, by the way, for our listeners, are linked in the show notes, The Generational Jumps, How HSIs Promote Upward Mobility. You explored the ways that HSIs promote upward social and economic mobility, which is a growing focus on the HSI community. We like to tout the things we do really well, and HSIs are actually quite good at promoting upward mobility. That's what we keep seeing. Again, the consistency, several reports that have come out, some research coming out, it keeps showing that upward mobility is a place where HSIs can say, yay, we're good at this. So tell us first about how policy intermediaries are generally defining and operationalizing upward mobility.
Yeah, so one of the big names that I think a lot of us have heard for quite some time is going to be Opportunity Insights at Harvard. It's the Chetty data, as everyone calls it. So that's the major player kind of in this research. Their measure that they use is called bottom to top mobility. So that essentially looks at who comes from the bottom 20% of parental income or quintile and who ends up in the top 20% as adults. They essentially multiply access times success equals mobility, and that essentially captures the most dramatic leaps, right? Bottom to top. And then another big player is going to be Brookings. So Brookings came out with what they call the middle class mobility measure. This intentionally and very explicitly builds on the Opportunity Insights measures, but they focus very intentionally on the middle class. So they essentially seek to answer what proportion from the third quintile move up at least one quintile, and they subtract those who fall, meaning those who experience some type of downward mobility. And a key insight in their work is they did highlight that middle class students who skip college actually do tend to experience that downward mobility. And so they underscore that higher education, contrary to some conversations today, isn't just about climbing, but it's also about not sliding back economically. And then another player here is going to be Third Way, and they have the Economic Mobility Index. So this is return on investment focused. So they essentially seek to answer how fast can low-income students, defined as families earning about $30,000 or less a year, recoup their degree costs. They look at the price to earnings premium multiplied by the percent of students Pell enrolled at a given institution. Basically, you have to enroll a lot of low-income students as well as deliver high returns in order to score high on the third way measure. So it essentially ends up ranking institutions into tiers as opposed to strict numbers.
Okay. Ooh, that's really helpful.
I can send you
Yeah, the middle class
the.
mobility or that down guess is really interesting because whenever I talk about upward mobility and HSIs, I'm like, that's why the sort of generalized thinking of if you have a high number of low income students, we're talking 60 to
Right.
70% of a campus, right? And some HSIs having low income students, you got a lot of room for upward mobility. So we should this
Yeah.
one, right? This should be a place where we're good at it versus an institution that's bringing in students who are like legacy students or private
Yeah.
elite institutions aren't they're just not going to see that because they don't have this they come in so high. So that's good. Okay, helps me think through the different ways we can use this measure because it is such an important measure in the HSI conversation. So how did you and your co-authors operationalize upward mobility within your study as you were thinking about HSIs?
Yeah. So this study actually builds on a sister report that the Center for MSIs and Mary Beth Gassman put out a couple years prior, which focused on upward mobility at HBCUs. And so we implement essentially the same methodological framework, but we apply it to HSIs, recognizing that, of course, we are fundamentally different institutions. But
Yeah.
we operationalize upward mobility by using the intergenerational income data from Opportunity Insights, which essentially links parents' income to their children's adult earnings using IRS tax records. So what we did was we took a more holistic approach, right? Because mobility is a nuanced concept. So we looked at the full parent to child's income matrix, and then we assessed different conceptualizations of upward mobility. So what these look like, and we talk about all of them in the report, was moving from the bottom to top quintile, as well as moving from the bottom 2 quintiles to the top 2 quintiles. We also charted any upward movement, so it doesn't matter even if it was 1 quintile, first to second to third, movement that lands anyone on the middle class or higher. And then we also looked at success rates, which is where outcomes were conditional on where someone started. And then this one, which I thought was really interesting, which was privilege perpetuation, which essentially answers the question of whether affluent students stay affluent. But taking these different approaches allowed us to take, like I said, that more nuanced approach. And it's really important because that allowed us to compare HSIs and PWIs a little bit more fairly, given that they have different student populations. But put simply, I would say upward mobility was operationalized as the proportion of students who move up in economic quintiles from the time they enroll to adulthood. The longitudinal component here is one thing that I think is really interesting, right? Because upward mobility folds over time, like it unfolds over time. It doesn't happen overnight at all. And what I think is critical is that we're assessing these smaller increases, right? So it's not just rags to riches. Moving from the lowest to the highest quintile is incredible. Those are just like to talk about, right? But what about moving from the first to the third or the third to the fourth? Because that movement isn't necessarily going to make headlines, right? It's not clickbait. But when you put these data together and you remember, which is so important for me, and I will scream it from the rooftops, is these aren't numbers. Like these are people's lived experiences. And in doing that, there actually is a story to tell. So for the people who are moving up, those movements indicate differences in their ability to support themselves, their families, to pay their bills, or to have the funds to handle a medical emergency that might have wiped them out 10 years prior. And so I think that's why this complicated approach really matters.
Yes, I appreciate it. Like I said, I learned a lot by reading this and then even just hearing you talk through the different types of measures. So another thing y'all talk about is like the institutional characteristics of HSIs. You stress in the report that HSIs are perpetually underfunded, right? And the institutional resources really play into student mobility. So talk to us about that.
Yeah, so, one thing that people really don't talk about is that the HSI designation itself requires institutions to demonstrate low expenditures compared to peer institutions
That part.
and enroll at least
That part.
50% low income students. Why do we forget that? There are waivers, there are circumstances, but that's the criteria. That is the groundwork that we are building from. So, like, by default, most HSIs are under-resourced. So to put it into a couple more numbers though, our report shows HSIs had a lot lower institutional expenditures than PWIs, comparing by 2012 HSIs had spent about $8,500 per student on instruction compared to $14,000 at PWIs. They cost less
Wow.
to attend, they have lower average SAT scores, and they're more likely to be public institutions, all of which collectively are markers of fewer resources, but not less potential. But of course, there was also a 2024 Government Accountability Office report, which I can send you. It's really big and it's really heavy, but it's really important. And they actually showed that the average HSI has a $95 million deferred maintenance backlog, and the average HSI
Yeah.
only spends about 4.6 million a year addressing those. They also documented
Mm.
that an estimated 43% of HSI building spaces on campus are in need of repair or replacement. And when you think about that, when you keep all of this in mind, it's actually incredibly impressive that HSIs are matching PWI outcomes with far fewer resources. So that just goes to say,
Right.
imagine what we could do with more investment, which is a hot topic right now.
Yes. Oh, yes. And I think getting at that last part is the whole idea that Title V grants are
Mhm.
institutional grants, right? That they're capacity building grants, that you can actually use those grants
Mhm.
to build up your infrastructure. Now, can it make up for that deficit? Absolutely not. But it gets back to the question about, are these funds being used specifically on Latina students, which I think most of us in the HSI community say they
Right.
should be, but there's there's even
Mhm.
bigger
Mhm.
as far as the infrastructure and the needs of HSIs, of just general infrastructure, like actual building maintenance. So I think it's just layered
Mhm.
and complex. But thank you for bringing that in, because I agree. I always say, yeah, by the way, institutions are also supposed to show that they're under resourced, but for the majority, they get the waiver anyways. So then I struggle
Mhm.
with that, right? Of like, why were we giving so many waivers
Mhm.
on that? If that's the reality, is that there are institutions that really need these funds, and then other ones that are often more competitive, right? The more resources, they're often
Mhm.
more competitive, right? That's what Aguilar Smith's
Yes.
research shows us very clearly, right? That the infrastructure for grant getting matters
Mhm.
too, right? About how you're successful. So, unlike the previous report, this one brought me joy and pride in HSIs. I even found myself thinking about my own trajectory and upward mobility, having graduated from an HSI, but not starting from the lowest quartile either. I want us to continue advocating for HSIs, knowing that they are doing more with less, as you
Mhm.
noted, right? And as the report notes. So my question is, what are your policy recommendations now,
Mhm.
considering what are, but also post September 10th versus what they were when you published the report, and or have they changed?
Yes. So I will say it's always so interesting to look back on your own work because time passes and you sit with it. And sometimes that's a pleasant experience, sometimes not. But I would say overall, I read through them and I wholeheartedly stand by each and every one of the recommendations in that. And I would actually argue that they have become monumentally more important now than they were at the time that they were written and published. Overall, each recommendation, which briefly includes promoting and advocating for HSI funding, assessing effective institutional strategies and resources that support low income and high need students, dig into differences in downward and upward mobility by student groups, low income students should enroll at HSIs, and study the differences between PWIs and HSIs on long term outcomes. That's all still critical. I think what's different now is not only the weight, but also the approach and the how we think about these things and our context for understanding them. So, objectively, I would say these recommendations are about a group of institutions that are going to continue to exist even if their legislative recognition is threatened. So, drawing on my earlier thoughts about what comes next, I would say we need to think about other sources of support streams, right? The possibility of a 2.0 down the road using my most optimistic lens, and taking this as a chance for a do-over. So let me get into a little bit more detail about how my thinking has changed. So that first recommendation says policymakers and funders alike should promote and advocate for additional funding. This one certainly remains true. I think it would be a matter of, like I said, the how. So we need to have a sharper reframe in some instances and showing how HSIs put work in beyond Latine students. So I'm not saying make them unimportant, but I'm saying make a case even so that even if you don't think HSIs matter, like even if you don't think there's value beyond nuestra gente, like we actually can show you that the groups that you do care about are housed at these institutions too, right? So, and I know it's complicated, but I'm of the camp that you have a case to make and to find a way to make the strongest case possible depending on the context of your audience. It isn't to say that our narrative and our stories don't matter. Obviously not. I would never say that. But I think it's about pushing back with a narrative that's going to make anybody's ears perk up. You want a story about access, like you've got one. So let me give you a little bit more just numbers to look at this, right? So I looked at some super basic descriptives. But when you look at HSIs versus non-HSIs, a higher proportion of HSIs offer AP credits, life experience credits, and military credits, as well as or evening college options than non-HSIs. And the one that really took me back the most when I was looking at this is the comparison for daycare. 42% of HSIs offer on-campus daycares compared to just 21% of non-HSIs. This is how you support
Wow.
families. This is how you create a strong
Yes.
workforce. And frankly, there are a ton of
Yes.
Latines, especially HSIs, who fall into these groups as well. So I think it's a way of saying, I'm going to help you help us, even if you don't know you're doing it, right? Because I think it's a way of strategically broadening the framework once you reel them in, and then you can move forward with the work that really matters. Like from where I'm standing, I would say just try and push back on the value of these institutions because HSIs are like completely and utterly undeniable.
Absolutely. Woo! All right. There we go. We got you advocating for HSIs. We need you right there on the front lines. Tell them, right? The reality is there's so much value that HSIs are producing for just in the like stroke of a pen, like literally like whoop, all that funding went away, right? It's just so
Mm.
disheartening, right? Start to really dig into all these different ways that HSIs make such a difference, right? For Latina students, their families, their communities, right? Overall. So thank you for bringing that to light. I think in light of how I started the conversation about we need to mourn and be in that grief, but also we need to find hope. Like you're giving me so much hope, right? Like they're hope. HSIs do such good work, and we're not going to stop doing the good work. That's the reality, right? Like it's going to continue, and we have no choice. It's just without those millions of dollars, which hurts.
Certainly.
So yeah, hurts a lot. So what are your thoughts on the significance of racialized funding streams like Title III and Title V? Because you spent so much time like
Yeah.
really digging into these, and the reality is we need to call them what they are. That's why it was so easy for them to defund them. For this administration to defund these programs in particular, it's because they are
Mm.
racialized. So talk about that and the significance of these racialized funding
Yeah.
streams.
So initially, I would want to say it's historical, right? But I kind of want to backslide on that because, and I think especially given our current context and climate, ICE raids, racially focused federal funding cuts, the broader rhetoric, I would argue that although, yes, history is critical for understanding the origin, how we got here, why this exists, put simply, historical barriers and systems were not created for racially minoritized populations. And as a whole, the outcomes of these historical differences, though, and this is what's important, are evident today across things like socioeconomic status, disproportionate punishment in elementary school, all the way through adult incarceration, lower access to healthcare and education, and unsurprising, worse mental and physical health outcomes, educational attainment, right? The list goes on. We know this. But what I will say, and as we all know, is it's important to recognize that we're not a monolith, right? So it's not every Latina person who's experiencing this, but when you look at the aggregate, these differences are there. You can't quite deny that. And so I think that's important to recognize. But here's the thing is I think that you often hear the incredibly simplistic argument of X happened Y years ago, get over it. Everyone can get where they want to now as long as they try. Like, not quite true. But I think that type
No.
of thinking really waters down the fact that Latine and other groups, but for this moment, I'm going to focus just on us, right, are affected by the holistic context that shapes not just outcomes today, but also policy, the climate that we're existing in, and access to resources. Right? Like people are scared. People are scared to drive to work because they might get pulled over. They don't know what's going to happen. There's violence. Like there's actual violence happening every day.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's why I want to kind of backslide on the history because disparities exist now. The problems are happening now. And before I go too deep down that rabbit hole, I would say that my point is that these funding streams aren't simply saying, oh, like ugly things happened in the past, here's some reparations, shut up and move on. They're put in place and they're
Mhm.
critical to helping ensure that the populations who are living in these disparate realities today have a little more support, right? It's so that we can invest in the communities that are already behind. Like, how many real life stories do HSI practitioners know about one mentor, one on campus resource center that actually changed the trajectory of a student's career? Like, how much bigger of a body of research do we need that shows that student support, sense of belonging, the resources that these funding streams support, like, matter before we can, like, collectively agree, like, these programs, good, they help. I think that these funding streams are actually not that big relative to the size of those they serve and relative to the impact they can make for the communities that they contribute to. Which really just begs the question, like, imagine what can happen when we can not only continue, but actually expand these resources.
Yes, it'd be so powerful. Thank you. Thank you for that. And you did exactly what I said in the beginning too, was like, we are going to center Latinx people in this
Oh,
conversation because we
yeah.
have to. There are specific attacks and violence on our
Mm-hmm.
community right now, right? So yes, we're absolutely going to do that. And it doesn't mean that nobody else matters. It means that there needs to be an
Mm-hmm.
elevated conversation about why it matters and why these funding streams matter to be able to support students that have very specific needs and have been left behind in many ways throughout their educational journeys. Higher ed does have to step in and fill in a lot of ways because the system has failed our students along the way, right? Like over and over again. So yeah, absolutely, I agree. The racialized funding streams are will continue to be significant. Let's hope into the future. We're putting it all. We're
Yes.
manifesting for the future. We know it's going to, as I mentioned, I just love that you're like a voice that we can put in front of policy folks, right? People, I think a lot about like, I write, but does my work really actually matter at that policy level where it matters? And I think you are doing research and work that does matter. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on like how scholars can better advocate for HSIs beyond the implication section of a journal article, right? Do staffers and legislators read our research? Do government relations folk read it, right? Like, does it
Yeah.
matter?
First of all, yes, it certainly does. I'll just jump into your question about do staffers, legislators, do they read their research? Like, most don't. Some, maybe a few do, right? I think it's certainly less than we would like. And most who do are only giving a quick skim before they got to go put out the next fire. I think they work in an arguably really volatile and rapidly changing environment, and most don't have the luxury to sit and think and read or write theory and think about all the possible approaches on these questions that we, in our job as researchers, are fortunate to dedicate our time to. But, and this is the exciting part of your question, is I do think there's an opportunity here, right? We can actually help it get seen and put that out there. I will start by saying academic research and this type of research, it has the reputation for rigor that it does for a reason, but it doesn't always have the reach, right? So what can we do? Create infographics, write briefs, make it short, make it snippy, make it pretty. Put it on social media, have your academic departments post it. More importantly, have your communications department do media outreach, figure out how to learn how to do that yourself. I would say engaging with associations and advocacy organizations, building those connections with the people who do talk to policymakers and funders, that's so important. And also talk to journalists and media. They're the ones who get these stories out. But when you do it, it's so important to speak their language when you do it, right? Don't talk about your regression models and use inaccessible jargon. What's important is to frame the language around why your findings matter, because they're looking for a story. And as academics, as writers, like, we are storytellers in our own way. And that's the core of research, is having something to say. So I think it's critical to take that and ensure that those stories are heard. So you, Gina, you specifically get a lot of attention, and I think that's amazing, and you are on people's radars. But I think, and I want to say this really specifically to the researchers who feel like, I'm so niche, like no one cares about this. You're wrong. Like, you're wrong. There are people who care about this, and they're at the heart of what you do. So be bold, make those connections, send 10 emails or DMs or LinkedIn messages. If even one person engages, like, you're beginning to create that reach. And I don't mean this in like an obnoxious networking, like, what can I get out of you way, because no one feels good about doing that. I certainly don't. I hate it. But I think it's more about connecting to the heart, right? Like, we share an interest in meaningful stories about our people and our communities. So how are we going to collaborate to get the word out there? Because at our core, I think what we do is based on the fact that we do care about the same things, even if we're maybe talking about them differently, right? And I think digging a little deeper, take a second to ask yourself, like, why you chose a career in this area to begin with. Because it wasn't for the fame, right? Like, it wasn't. I think for a lot of us, it's because it's really a privilege and honor to get to do this work. Like when I think about my own pathway and occupying the space where someone like you thinks I have something worth saying, to know that an
Yes.
organization like Haku, like that's out there in the trenches, on the hills, pointing to the numbers and stories that I gained the skills to be able to tell, and to tell in a way that policymakers and funders want to be a part of, to do stuff that gets media attention, is so exciting and like deeply humbling. But it's not because of me, it's not because of seeking notoriety, it's because it means that I get to be a part of a small but so incredibly mighty community of thinkers who's
Mhm.
collectively working to push the needle forward for our people. And ultimately, and this is so important, to honor those who came before us, right? Because those people like left their homelands, they made countless sacrifices for you and me to be sitting here at Berkeley at your today. And so I think that having a voice isn't just a privilege, but it's a responsibility, and we need to take that extra effort to use it.
Yes. We're going to plus one all of that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It is. And we have to be reminded sometimes as researchers that our voice does matter, our story, right? Our stories matter, the stories we're telling, even if we're not on the 5 o'clock news, right? Like I see scholars on CNN. I'm like, I want to be a
Yeah,
scholar on CNN, right?
certainly.
Like, and we're not all there. But as you said, we're having an impact in these different ways. And thank you for sharing other ways that we can have a greater impact, right? Like slow but great impact, I think is important. So then speaking of projects, what's new project you're working on? What can we expect to see in the near
Yes.
future?
So I got a few things in the works. I'm excited about it. Actually, this is not HSI related, but Hispanic career, Latine related. I have a report that just dropped today that's part of a larger project, which is dualities in diaspora, and it's looking at the Cuban immigrant experience. I talked to people who exiled over 50 years ago, and that was an incredible experience, and being able to
Wow.
give voice to that story. And that's just one part of a larger project that I'm very excited about. But because this is a podcast about HSIs, I'm also very excited to share. I'm currently working on a project with Melissa Salazar at Escala, as well as Stephanie Aguilar
Hmm.
Smith. We are a very excited to be doing this work. We're collaborating. We're doing a study. Mary Beth Gassman is supporting it through the Center for the Study of Minority Serving Institutions. And what we're going to be looking at is essentially a part two of the Trump administration funding cut report, because we want to look at the impacts of the funding losses. We're going to have a survey actually launching this week, and then we're going to be doing follow-up interviews. So it's going to be twofold. So we're going to basically be like, hey, program directors, students, administrators, anyone who was working on this, what was your experience? What did you lose? What happened on campus? Tell us. We want to know, because yes, we have those numbers and they're so huge and so important, but like, what really happened? Give me a chisme. I want to know because it's important. And so, like I said,
Yeah.
it's going to be a survey and then a report on that for one part. And then we're going to be doing follow up interviews. And we will be at AC talking about it and doing some interviews. So, very excited to be a part of that and to be a part of this community and to be able to come together during this
Hmm.
really hard time and shed light on this.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, we need to tell those stories because we're not hearing all that and all the tremendous loss and layers. I love that you're working with Melissa, is one of my really good friends, and we talk about like me and Melissa are sort of collateral damage and all this, right? We're not direct loss, but we get to work with HSIs a lot, right? We're supported by HSIs as well to do different work, and we're also have lost tremendous amount of resources to be able to do that, right? Because of this, and that work was making a huge difference, right? We know it matters, the work that Melissa was doing, work I do at campuses, to actually change, to move the
Mm-hmm.
needle, right? Like on cultural on campus. And that's we're at a loss too, right? Like where there's layers to the loss, right? I think it gets back to my original comments about we need to mourn the loss, but then also we move on. And I guess that would be my final question before the final ¿Qué pasa question? How are you grieving the loss of HSI funding and also thinking about how we can work through this grief? And I think it's connected to your
Yes.
project.
Yeah. I was pissed. I am pissed. I think there's a grief component, but I think for me it's shifted to a bit of anger, outrage. But I talked to colleagues, I talked to friends. I was processing it in a way that I think so many of us did and are doing. And then I was like, all right, I buried myself in the data and the numbers. I made it my mission to tell this story, and I'm still trying to do that. It started with going through the years of grant data, because let me tell you, pulling together all of the grant data and cleaning it to create what I did to be able to do the Trump report, like that took some time. But being able to quantify that loss was really important to me. And so now it's continuing with the collaborative work with these two absolutely stellar women. Um, and I'm just at a point where like I want to be in communication with HSI folks because I haven't had the opportunity to do as much of that on the ground work and make those connections and get into those stories. And so I think being in a position now where I can engage with practitioners and understand what is happening at the institutional level and getting, like I said, into that human impact is really important to me right now. And I think for moving from that high level policy level that I've been in for so long to be able to really wrap my head around what this really looks like for people. And I think I want to use all of this to make a case for how we move forward. And the grief has become fuel, right? And so I think that's how I'm working through it.
Yes, yes, same. I agree. I agree. We got to sit with it, right? Whatever that is, but let it be our fuel for the next thing. I mentioned in the beginning that I didn't record an entire season of Que Pasa HSIs, and it really was connected to all of it. I couldn't bring people into the space and be like, let's talk about HSIs when like everything was crumbling. Like literally I would have been producing that season. I couldn't do it. There was no way. But I think we're feeling better. We're starting to get through it and start to find that fuel and our passion in this work. Because this is passion work. It is. It's our heart work. We put everything into it, all our full corazon into the work, right? So thank you for reminding us of that and giving us the high level policy stuff. This was amazing conversation. I've learned a lot and I hope our listeners will as well. But before you get out of the podcast, you got to answer the final question. You know
Yes,
the
I do.
question. Get by guys.
All right, so yeah, que pasa HSIs. We are in a moment of reckoning. I think we're in a moment of needing support, of coming together and of using our voices. I think we need to take a step back and also take a second to just recognize how far we've come while also allowing space for the moments where the grief and the anger rise because they will. That's inevitable.
Right.
But I think it's also a moment of giving ourselves a space to bear the complicated feelings that we're all experiencing in our own ways, but then recognizing like we're not going to stay there. We're not going to stay there. We all come from these really complicated histories and we haven't stayed there in the past. We're not going to do it now. So I think that means we have to channel that energy, engage in collective action, be there for one another, listen to each other's stories, get them heard, because at the end of the day, we're a community, like scholars, practitioners, advocates, students, and we've been doing the work before Title V even existed. This was already in the works, and we're going to be doing it long after this administration, right? The funding matters, but it was never the only thing sustaining us. And I think our commitment to our communities is. I would say lean on your networks, show up for each other, and remember, as I said earlier, use your voice because having it is not only a privilege, but a responsibility. And remember, HSIs aren't going anywhere.
What's up? Yeah. Thank you for being with me today on Que Pasa HSIs.
Thank you.